Welcome back. In the last video tutorial, what we talked about was a little bit about understanding the basic interface of Dreamweaver and what some of the actions are. For example, what the properties window does and what these inserts allow you to do. But in order to get started with this, if I were to just close this window that I had open previously, we can see we've got the welcome screen. So what we want to be doing is creating a new HTML page inside of Dreamweaver. Now if we were going to do that, I'm going to just show you exactly what's going on with this. But the best way for us to get started inside of Dreamweaver is to define a site. And that's the first thing that we're going to do. So here's what I'd like you to do. You can define a site by either coming up to this icon right here, and as you can see, you can say new site, or you can manage existing sites. But just to get us on the same page, I'm going to say site from the top site menu, and I'll say new site. All right, well, the site window has been greatly simplified in the CS5 version of Dreamweaver in comparison to the previous versions of Dreamweaver. And that is something that is always going to be advantageous for anybody working with this, especially for anybody who's coming to Dreamweaver for the first time. So what you can see here is there's the site information, there's server information, version control is another aspect that we'll look into later, and there are also advanced settings. Well, normally speaking, the only thing that you need to do and to worry about when you're concerned with creating your site is to, as we mentioned when we were talking about planning your site, you want to have all of the resources for your website located and stored in one nice convenient location. Also, if you remember, when we were talking about how the web works and discussing the information about having your website local on your computer, the computer that's right in front of you, that's the local information. And server information is enabling us to upload our websites to a specific server. So in order for us to do that, we're going to have to enter in server information. Now we're going to talk about servers a little bit later and testing on your server in future video tutorials, and in doing so I'm going to concentrate only on the server rather than the local information. However, if we're talking about local information, in other words, here on the computer that's sitting right in front of you, that is your local computer. So what I want to do is to define where on this local computer you can find all of the files and the folder, more specifically, that contains all of the files that go into making my website what it is. So first and foremost, we can give a site name. Now if you remember, we talked about naming convention when we were discussing websites before, and naming conventions are something that are really specifically important to files, folders, and images. However, this particular site name need not conform to those naming conventions because it's got nothing to do with your HTML files. It's only going to allow Dreamweaver to understand where we are. So I can just write, my first site. In other words, my first Dreamweaver web page. And here we can say local site folder. Now, we don't have a local folder made. However, Dreamweaver will allow us to choose one. So I'm just going to click on this little browse icon right there. And what you can do is just go to your desktop. And here I'm pointing to on my Mac, my desktop. If you're on a PC, not a problem. You can just point to your desktop from the drop-down menus. And let's create a new folder. This new folder, now this does conform to naming conventions because folders, files, and images are what we're going to be uploading to the web. So nevertheless, I'm just going to write here root. Now that's not a very intuitive name, I must admit, but this is just for our testing purposes and we're just experimenting with this website. Should you, for example, be hired to create a website for company X, then more than likely you'd be naming this root folder by the company's name, company X. And you would never leave a space. If you remember, you would say either company _X or something along those lines. So I'm just going to call this root. And if I wanted to, I could also say, for example, root _folder. Now remember, the underscore is an acceptable special character. Spaces, however, are not acceptable when naming our files. So root folder is the folder that I'm going to create. Notice it is now located on my desktop. So this is the folder that I will choose as my local site folder, and you should be able to follow this path to your desktop and whatever your folder was called, in this case root folder. Alright, well at that point I could, if I knew how to, go to my server and enter my server information. But as I mentioned, we're going to discuss how to work with that and what to do with that in a future video tutorial. As well, we'll also talk about some of the advanced settings inside of this window. But for the most part, this is really all you need to do to get started and to start working inside of Dreamweaver. So you should always remember that whenever you're starting a new project, it's extremely important to define your site. And by doing so, you can take advantage of Dreamweaver's site management window and allow you to really use the strengths of this application to your advantage. So I'm going to save that, and you'll notice now that in this Files menu or window right here, look, I'm just going to double click on the CSS styles to collapse it so that we could see more of this window. Well, notice it says Local Files, and in here it says Site, My First Site, right? So that's what I called it, My First Site. And you can see that there is another list here. You can, show me what's on my computer if I wanted to, what's on my Mac hard drive if I wanted to, or some of the other sites that I've also created. And these are just ones that I use personally. This is one for Concordia University where I teach. There's one for Killer Sites who we're doing this work for. And this is the one that we just created ourselves, My First Site. So notice there's nothing in that folder, and that's to be expected. But what we're going to be doing soon enough is to create the information that we have in this folder, and we'll create the skeleton of our website. In other words, the very basic pages that are going to be built upon for us to create our entire site. So we'll do that when we come back in the next video.